Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. I'm Ramon Mejia here. I bring you the latest RPG news, reviews, and of course, author interviews. And this week I have the privilege of speaking to an author whose debut novel, Beginner's Luck, is set to release on October the 31st. It's definitely one of the more interesting and well thought out and definitely detailed game mechanic wise RPG novels I've read in quite a long time. Like just reading the beginning, I was like, wow, this is good. And so it's definitely exciting to have him on the podcast. Welcome, Aaron J.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. And you're one of the handful of people who've read the novel, so it's just really nice.
Yeah, no, that was kind of part of the issue. I'm like, wait, I can't do author interview, I can't do like audience questions because nobody's read it yet. I'm like, that's unfortunate.
Whoops. Well, we'll try and fill it the time somehow.
We'll have to figure something out. I know. Okay, let's begin with like a basic introduction. Who are you? Give us a little bit of background on yourself, and maybe an elevator pitch for Beginner's Luck.
Okay, so my full name is Aaron J. Weingrad. I dropped the Weingrad just because it took up a lot of space on the cover, and I wanted to have a sense of scale, and I didn't want my name to be bigger than on the cover. I have worked at a lot of different jobs over my life. I was a chef. I laid brick. I was a paralegal. But I had always had a creative interest, and I made a couple of movies. Post-college, came out to Hollywood, and sort of somewhat ran into a brick wall. But I found myself eventually working for New Line during like the Lord of the Rings years, which was pretty amazing. Got a lot of really great swag, which I still have in my garage. Endless numbers of T-shirts and collectibles, which is pretty awesome. But eventually, New Line was folded into Warner Brothers, and I got laid off. So hey, welcome to America. That's life. That was right when my wife was pregnant, and we started having kids, and I had my own company trying to do similar things, and that was going okay, but it was hard with the kids and with everything else, but you know, pay the bills. And then, you know, I had written a number of screenplays, and I'd had some interest here and there, but like the whole gatekeeper thing of just, let's be topical. Eventually, you need a guy like Harvey Weinstein to like want your stuff, and that could be problematic. It's
problematic in retrospect now, yes.
Yeah, well, no, it was problematic then too. I mean, I'm not cute enough to, be in that kind of danger, but you're still basically talking about trying to get a handful of people to pay your stuff.
I absolutely understand.
Yeah.
Definitely a big thing. It's in the movie industry, especially. Listening to Kevin Smith's story is very similar. Like he wrote a thing, and if it wasn't for one guy looking at it and say, I want to make this thing, he never would have had a career. And so that's definitely a big part of that experience.
The art director on my first film was Kevin Smith's art director. I mean, he and I grew up in Philadelphia, and Kevin Smith is, the producer of Jersey, but Jersey's just across the river back there. And yes, a lot of the same people. I mean, it's not a big film community out there, so the people. So when you're doing stuff, it's the same because there's just not that much going on in that neck of the woods. So thank you, Kevin Smith, for giving that guy the opportunity to get trained up, so he knew about me. So that's that.
So perfect. So you're in the movie industry, you're writing screenplays, you're trying to make your stuff. How does that lead into writing a novel in LitRPG? I'm kind of curious.
So I sort of left the creative side of things, and I just started doing something called distribution, which is where you just are selling movies with the movie theaters. So someone has to, negotiate the stuff and convince the guys who own the movie theaters to like play your movies. And so every Monday in America, you guys might not know this, but after the whole weekends go by, everybody looks at the numbers and everybody talks to each other. It's like, hey, please keep me on the big screen, or like, no, don't kick me off for the new thing. And it's just this big mad scrabble, and then everybody has to get all the prints to move around and get around. So I did that for like 7 years, and but then when New Line sort of got basically dismantled, I had to do something to sort of earn some money, and I did a number of other things. But eventually, I just was trying to look for something that I could do that used a lot of the skills that I developed over the years, that I could do flexibly, around a whole lot of other things. I mean, not to get too much into my own weeds, but I have other things that I was doing, and I was like, this is something I can actually do my own time, if I can get 3 hours a day here and there, or, that's a good day for writing, I mean, I can't always get 3 hours a day together, but if I can, that's a couple of scenes for sure.
Okay, so basically you turned your screenwriting skills into novel writing skills. I mean, storytelling is storytelling. Even if the format changes, fundamentally, it's the same concept of telling a tale and people being interested in it or not. And I think this medium of self-publishing is especially useful and helpful in getting your stories out there, because there is no gatekeeper, unlike the movie industry where somebody has to pay a lot of money to make a film and to produce it and to distribute it and to market it. The self-publishing industry in ebooks, especially for like smaller communities like the LitRPG community, it's really easy. It's like, write a thing, press a button, and it goes up on for sale, and it'll live or die by its own merits, and it's the audience that decides whether or not it's a success, not somebody else.
And one of the things that's awesome about that is also, people's unique interests are what are going to drive us, and then it turns out that there are a number of people who have like the same interests. So, in other words, like the big publishing sci-fi labels could have done LitRPG. I mean, there's always on the Facebook group, people always talk about when was the first LitRPG book. And so people go back to like Crying Deep or Guardians of the Flame, which is back in the 80s. And so there's obviously been a desire for this kind of a book for a long time. And it wasn't until people themselves could sort of self-organize that all of a sudden our genre like comes together, which is great, because you're never going to get like people, we're going to have to put however much money behind this book. They're not going to try and create this genre on their own. Tor was never going to do that. King was never going to do that. But it's there.
Right, perfect. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Now tell me a little about your book itself, because we're talking about how you got here. But we haven't actually told the audience what the book is about yet. Sure. Like, wait, I read it. You read it. The audience hasn't read it yet. So give me the elevator pitch for Beginner's Luck, and then we'll talk a little bit about more of the writing stuff, and we'll get into like the actual plot later. But give me the elevator pitch for Beginner's Luck.
So, you may not be familiar with is the idea that technology will sort of build on itself to a critical mass, and then boom, all of a sudden, AI and computing and nano and all this stuff will come together, and it should be this great moment where all of a sudden everything's great, where we have all these amazing new powers and wealth and choice and wonderful things like that. But in my book, it turns out that human nature doesn't actually change, and if you give people a whole bunch of power, they will turn on each other, and so it all sort of goes horribly wrong. And now humanity is just kind of living what's left of it in these protected little areas. And Miles Boone is my main character, and he is finally an adult, and he's allowed to go and roll up his permanent character, because it turns out that the way humanity is surviving is basically playing a game against and also sort of with the wild and feral nano that is out there, and trying to sort of domesticate it into conceiving of things like a game. And so he's going out there, but his family has enemies, and human nature still hasn't changed even after all of this. So it turns out that the game is somewhat run largely by the party. So hey, so they've sort of cornered all the power and success in the game, success in life. And if you don't get a decent shot at playing a decent game, you're not going to do very well in life. And so he just wants a decent shot at all of this. But his family's enemies corner him, and he makes a desperate bet. And then the rest of the plot is based on just him trying to win this bet and trying to outplay, outthink, outsmart some relatively, I hope, smart, difficult villains who have their own justifications for what they're doing and why too. So they're there, and that's the book.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I like that. There is definitely politics in the story. There's stories about artificial intelligences going wild, nanotechnology in the wild. We don't actually really see in this particular novel. I assume it's going to come up later on in this series. We actually see the devastated world that is implied in like historical references, like backstory synopsises in the novel. But it mostly does focus on your main character, who is the heir to a particular faction of this community, and his opinion versus the larger majority. And it's a lot of the story revolves around human nature. What is the best way to try to save humanity? And the different ways that people try to enforce their will and their opinions, whether they're the government or just individuals. And that's a part of it, but also the part that makes it LitRPG, of course, is that it's set in a virtual reality game, and that's how they're combating against it's supposed to be not a metaphor, but what happens in the game actually affects the real world, because it's an instance of nanites and nanites.
It's not so much a virtual world as sort of maybe a telepresence, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, it's a representation. Yeah,
and also, I mean, just so people know, I mean, I didn't get out there and just start grinding my axe about the world, and but I just used it as in some ways as a device to sort of do what hopefully is also just a good adventure. Like I basically try and have my hero just beat him down with entertaining monsters and problems, and make him struggle, and hopefully we enjoy that, because that's what's enjoyable, is to like watch somebody.
Oh yeah, and that's absolutely all there. Yeah. The adventure part and the game mechanics details are based off of what is it, D&D 3.5, I think. And
it's pretty.
Yeah, it's pretty evident. That kind of made me smile when I read them. Like, oh yeah, I know that rule set. I'm very familiar. I think to me that's the best rule set as far as I'm concerned. It just had flexibility, and it had enough detail that you can kind of do what you want to do, at least until you get to the higher levels. Like those early levels in that rule set are very, very nice. And so I'm a big fan of it, which is part of why I enjoyed the book probably so much. But this is one of the cases where your real world storyline, for me at least, was as interesting as like the game stuff, and the game stuff is really good. It's very adventurous. It's very, compelling. You also try to bring a sense of realism to the game system for the instance of your main character, which is kind of cool and everything. But overall, it's really nice. Not a lot to say. So thank you very much for letting us know a little bit about that. We'll get into like some more character stuff in a minute. But going back to just your writing career, you're officially a writer in a couple days, or from the watcher's point of view, the day that this comes out is the day that your book should be coming out, and so you'll actually be a published author at that point. And how does that make you feel to know that you're going to be a published author?
It is actually, I guess just I think people have sometimes a habit of just sort of trying to downplay what something's going to mean to you, because if it doesn't work out the way you want, you don't like, this is really important to me. It's like, oh, okay. But it actually feels like pretty amazing. It really is. To know that like people are actually, the fact that there's some pre-sales, like that people I don't know. It's not my cousin. It's not my mom. Like random people are going to read it, and I think I'm really hoping that they're going to enjoy it. I've also read all those people's anecdotes, authors' anecdotes about like what the reviews were like, and people say, oh, it's a troll, but then they also get all these people who are kind and admirous. So I don't know. I'm actually pretty pumped. It's been sort of a funner week than I had in a long time. So yeah.
Well, good. I'm happy that you're enjoying the experience of this whole process, because for some people it's very nerve biting. Like they're worried right until the very last minute where their first reviews come out, and like enjoy the experience, because this is as you go on, it becomes less novel, I suppose, of your first book. But it's a nice time, to be honest. So you talked about where you came from, how you were basically applying your storytelling abilities from movies and film, and that part of your life, which was a huge portion of it, into LitRPG. And we'll get to like how you got here. But let's talk about first what inspired you to write in the first place, because it's a really big leap from reading and watching movies to actually being creative and putting things on the page and telling your own story. So how did you get, what inspired you to go there?
Well, I guess I think I felt like I had a good stories in me. This sounds sort of corny and whatever, but over the years with my kids, I told them a contiguous, very elaborate series of bedtime stories that my wife was always saying I should write down. I don't know anything about children's literature, and I'm also not a great artist, so I just didn't think that would actually sort of work out. But but I did over a number of years. So I mean, I think I had that in me, and also I have like a lifelong connection to this fandom insofar as I mean, I played, the Blue Book original Dungeons and Dragons with my brother when we were really young. And it's just been a lifelong thing. And when you get down to it, those kinds of games are just collaborative storytelling. So yeah, and of course, I have my video game years as well. And so that's I think that, and then of course, I loved reading this genre. I mean, I've read really, really widely, just sort of generally, but there's something about this that made it seem like if you write like the advice of like write what you love, and it's so much easier. Like I've wrote a lot of screenplays in a number of different genres, and it's harder, or it's like a lot harder than when you write something you actually like you just enjoy. So yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think that's always good advice. So write what you love, write what you know, is also always nice too. But when you're writing something that you already have a passion about, that you've already just done research about for hundreds of hours, just because you like,
yeah.
It makes pulling that information into something creative a little bit easier. I myself personally never had any notions of writing ever, like a novel, to be honest. But as a consumer, yeah, so many great stories, and then it's just like, oh, I have to do something with these things. These are ideas in my brain, and I'll write them down. And if people like them, I'll publish it. Great. If they don't, that's not a big deal. But it's a big step to go from consumer to creative. But I think it's not as hard if you talk about, again, the thing that you love, the thing that you know something about. And for a lot of video game people, a lot of people who play tabletop games and RPGs, like this is the genre to do that in, because you have literally years and years of experiences, sometimes decades, of playing video games and learning mechanics and telling and kind of getting the idea of what those stories are, like how they're set up narrative wise. And so translating those like literally, I mean, decades of experience sometimes into, a couple hundred pages, that's not as difficult as you might think. It's just starting. And yeah, there are a lot of technical things to learn as far as the writing goes, but the storytelling part, like, you'd be surprised how many instances and how much experience people have if they've been playing video games or, watching, playing tabletop games for like a lot of their life.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for sure. And some of my best memories of my entire life are just, the camaraderie of playing with, some friends, like that is, we used to, in caveman days, we'd go out and hunt with spears all together. And I'm sure that was like a deeply bonding kind of thing. And now we basically do the same thing, except, we have a controller and not a spear. That's a deep, emotional place, actually.
No, I definitely agree with you that part is, it's I think we talked about this a little bit off air, but like the human experience and that need for connecting with other people, and whether it's group experiences in the real world or online, that same connection is very relative and important to the human experience. And so even translating those experiences into a novel form, the novelization of those experiences is almost like you're sharing your story around a campfire, of this is what happened, or this is what you imagine happened, in the case of like novelizations and fiction and stuff. But it's still a shared experience in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Next question we have, let's see, which writers inspire you? So does anybody in particular inspire you? Like, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but like where is your journey for coming into the lit RPG community? Because we talked about, okay, you're bringing in your experiences from screenplay, from writing and developing movies, and storytelling in that respect, into writing this actual thing. But where did lit RPG actually come into your life, and how did that transition as like you deciding to write a novel in this genre in particular?
Well, so I've always been like a sci-fi fantasy fan. And like, in no sense was I a big Hollywood player, by the way. I truly was a cog in the machine. Let's see, what would have been the first? I mean, I read like the stuff that sometimes people say is like the jumping off point of it, like, the Joel Rosenberg's thing, like way back in the day. But as far as like what people would know as LitRPG. I would say, Alter World and The Land, and I just started realizing there was like, um, and so, and I was just basically looking for more content that like sort of, worked for me. And then I just started having this sort of, I guess, relationship with the genre, and I found the Facebook group Balance at first, and that was really a great resource just to find more work. Now it seems like there's more books than I know what to do with in the genre. So thank you, Ramon, for helping to curate this quite a bit, because there's more than I could possibly get to myself. I actually don't know how you actually do that. But yeah, you read these things, you think like, that would be really cool. I would love to tell a story like this. And there were certain aspects of it also I wanted to try and that I wanted in some of the books that I thought like other people might also want to, like that I wanted to sort of emphasize. I mean, it's funny because it's like this niche genre, but obviously even within that, there's like, niches of like, the dungeon core, or the wuxia infused kind of thing, or the world of work, and so like there were things that I was like, okay, there are aspects that I kind of wanted to sort of concentrate on, and hopefully there are people who will like that. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. I think the genre lit RPG, people don't explore it as widely as it could be. To me, like you get a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, and that's kind of it for a lot. But there's just so many opportunities. Like as many video games as have been played, and genre types of video games there are, or tabletop games. That's as many lit RPG stories possible genre-wise. I mean, whether it's going to be dungeon master stories like The Divine Dungeon, or Slime Dungeon Chronicles, or like you said, just regular portal fiction like Developers LLC, The Land, Adventures in Terror, whatever the case is. There's just so many more storytelling opportunities than I think a lot of people realize, and I think that's what kind of makes your novel different, in that you are telling the story from a different perspective. It's not portal fiction. It's not pure fantasy VR MMO stuff. There's a real life aspect to it set in the future that I think creates a very compelling story premise and a very compelling world in which that justifies going into these games long term. And so I think that is definitely part of what, like, literally reading the first few pages, 10, 15 pages of your novel, I'm like, I could already tell, like, oh, this is going to be great. Like, this is good. This is
thanks,
like,
man.
like the world building is there, and like your setups are great, and like I was already really invested in your characters and what they were doing, and so I was like, this is like, I could already tell, like, oh, this guy has good storytelling chops. Like, I didn't know that you were a screenwriter or a screenplay writer, and it makes really good sense because, like I said, that skill set is not really that different from this skill set. It's telling a story. Like, maybe the formatting is different. Like, you have to like translate some, instead of being a 3-act structure to a 4-act structure, whatever the case is. But it's storytelling, and like if you're good at that, then you're probably going to be good at this, because especially probably better, because a lot of the newbies like myself, or like first-time writers, they have literally no experience formatting a story. Like, they can tell anecdotal stuff. This is what happened to me when I got really drunk. But like actually telling like a longer story like requires a little bit of experience or research, structuring it correctly, and setting up and foreshadowing and all that good stuff. And that's a little more challenging if you've never done it. Like when you know the story, just like first page, I'm like, oh, this guy is like some sort of storytelling tops, and I really appreciate it. But like I said, your world is compelling from the get go. So let's talk a little bit about your story itself, where you've sort of mentioned it, in that this world is set in the far future, with the, what's the word again? The technical word, the artificial intelligence conversion.
Singularity.
Singularity. That's it. I couldn't remember it, my friend. Thank you. So the singularity happens. There's gigantic wars of the technology. Nano devices and weapons essentially ruin the world, and so that's the world we're setting up in. So did you actually research that kind of technology and what it might potentially do to people, and how did you decide on the almost clan-like structure of the world that we kind of walk into for beginner's luck?
Well, I definitely did do a bunch of research. I mean, some of it like was intentional as I was writing the book, and some of it is just also like, you know, if you're a sort of sci-fi fantasy oriented person, you probably, you know, are drawn to, you know, clickbait, but it's a little more about tech and whatever. Certainly, like, there's been no end of billionaire tech guys who have been talking about warning about AI. There was a guy named Kurzweil who's a sort of futurist, you know, probably about 10 years ago, who, you know, I think first coined the term singularity. You can kind of, you know, people talk about like Moore's law and computing doubling. I mean, you know, it does seem sort of exponential in some ways. And as soon as the sort of gap between manipulating the real world and the fact that computing is going so fast, and you can kind of almost see it, you know, in the fact that also, you know, people are worried about the economy because, you know, people's jobs are getting automated out of existence. We're heading somewhere. So, you know, that was definitely sort of a background. I mean, I really wanted to just sort of try and ground it as much as I could. Like, so I just ground the thing in things that I thought were at least like sort of somewhat realistic predictions of whatever could happen. And then that would be a great foundation just to have like a really cool adventure. And I mean, you know, when you do that, it's good too, because, you know, you can, it's easier to sort of imagine your character. The more you sort of imagine the world, the more you can imagine like, well, what would my character be thinking about? What would that sort of be like? You know, it gives you stuff to riff off of, and, you know, crack some jokes and have some setups and do a bunch of stuff like that. I mean, Neil Stevenson is someone who I, you know, tremendous. I don't think I'm, you know, passionate on him, but like that is like my. That guy, I think, is, like, you know, literally a genius. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at with it all. Yeah, and you know, the other thing is I just kind of wanted. Yeah. Oh, so here's something that also I just didn't want to also a main character who was like just too whiny. I also just like, okay, I didn't want him to be like a Mary Sue who's going around and be like, I can handle this. I also didn't want a guy who's just sort of like, oh, gee, you know, you know, I wanted to just try and make a character who. You enjoy spending time with, because, you know, he's having a tough time of it, but he's trying to keep a good attitude, but sometimes it's a little overwhelming. But he's trying, you know, he's got a goal. You can see why he's going through what he's doing and why he wants to do what he wants to do. And it's, you know, and it's something that we hopefully all can sort of empathize with.
Yeah, I think people who've gone through problems and survived them and come out stronger from them, and the trials that they face in life sometimes, or their opposition. Anybody who's gone through that can absolutely relate to this particular character in the story, because he definitely faces a lot of opposition. He starts off with basically trying to essentially level the playing field for himself in the world, because we have to emphasize that the game world and the real world are intricately tied up here in your universe, in that everything's controlled by nanites, everything by nanotechnology. So everybody's food, everybody's clothing, all the luxuries that are possible within this almost post-apocalyptic world are resources from nanotechnology, and so that resource is not infinite, and so the distribution of that resource is dependent upon gameplay in this virtual reality world, because again, everything revolves around fighting in the nano bad guys, so the nano, you know, weapons in the world. And so that's what that game is. That VR game is actually important to humanity's survival. What, again, the things that humanity does in the world, fighting monsters, that translates to fighting bad nano machines in the wild, in the rest of the world, basically. And so that game is intricately connected to the social structures that develop in this new future, including getting resources for food. Like, you don't have to play the game, but you're going to get a minimum of like the worst, crappiest basic rations ever, and you're never going to have luxuries. And so, if you want to increase your stature, increase your wealth, then you have to do well in the game. And so, very much in this system, there's this very understandable stratification of the people who do well in the game and the people who don't. And the people who do well in the game want to stay doing well, and so they modify the game to benefit their faction. And anybody who's not a part of that faction very much becomes a second class citizen, um, and very often they become indentured to the haves. And I thought that structure was very interesting. I'm like, oh, that's like, so that very does, for many people, mimics our world in a lot of ways. People who have wealth and they want to keep it, and they rig the system so that they do. And people who don't have wealth have a very hard time ever coming out of it, even generationally. And so the parallels between that world and our world are very evident, but it's also, this is fantasy because we're using nanite instead of money, but the same thought process are very relatable, and I thought that was really cool. And so our main character, or sorry, your main character, I always think it was part of me because he's like my friend, Miles. Miles, you're my friend. Starts off with he's trying to bribe one of the GMs who's supposed to monitor the fairness of the game worldish, I guess.
Yeah.
I've always questioned, like, well, if he's a GM, but he doesn't actually influence the game in the game, then he's just kind of like a gatekeeper between the game and the real world. So I'm like, okay.
Wait for future volumes.
Yeah, okay, I'll have to wait and see. But he basically tries to bribe him with like his own saved nanites, so that he'll get the same package as as the main faction. I forget what's their name again.
The Eastmans.
Yeah, the Eastmans.
The party. Yeah,
it's the party. That's right. It's the party.
Yeah, the party.
Clan, or is the party? So the party. That's the big controlling faction of the game currently, and they basically set up the system so that anyone who joins their party gets benefits during character creation, and they get like an easier time of like getting out of the noob zone and getting like the really good quests and the really good monster experiences, so they can progress better and do better in life, basically. But anybody who's not a part of the clan, you're kind of SOL, or you're gonna have a really hard time getting out of that system. And so the main character tries to bribe his way into that same package, and he succeeds, except that someone kind of basically catches him. And so then it goes into like there's a bet between a representative from the Eastmans and himself, and there's a big philosophical discussion about, oh, is the system rigged? And no, it's not. It's for the benefit of mankind. But the basic premise is like, oh, he's going to bet his life and his future that he can, if he's given a fair shot, that he can do as good or better than anybody in the party. And that's kind of the core of that's like the thing that motivates everybody for the main character for the storyline. So I forget where my question was going. Okay, so sorry, I got off on my tangent. So Miles Boone. So tell me about Miles Boone and what motivates him to do this kind of stuff.
Well, he's the son of a guy who, most of us think the world of their father. This guy, the father could save the world. Well, his dad was really part of the team that actually did so. But he's a guy who believes in sort of equality of opportunity, So I mean, so it's interesting. Some of the things that you're talking about are things that I was thinking about when I was writing the book. Like, life is sort of a game in a lot of ways. Like, life is a game. It's a very simple game, but it's a game that you have to play for yourself and with people in your family and the people outside of that. And the choices that you make, the kind of game you play, I mean, it's just a metaphor, but like, when you're talking about just how do you navigate your way through life, that's a good metaphor. And so Miles, sees this system where, the kinds of game that you can play is really constrained. And like, that's really the tragedy that it's, like, I think there's always going to be some people who succeed more than others, but the question is like, do we all have an opportunity to actually play our kind of game and have the kinds of successes that we can have, and that's everything in some way. That's actually like your life. How do you live your life? Like, if you can't live your life the way you want to live your life, that's not good. And it doesn't mean that you can have like, everything in the world, but it just means that you should have like the opportunity to sort of live your life out. So I mean, that's what he's sort of fighting for. And that's also what he's sort of convinced that, like, if you do that, the game to sort of to control, not control, that's really not the word, the game to sort of tame the world and make the world something that everybody can live in without, being basically almost in this little, safe zone. That's how you do it, and the other people don't. They don't see it that way. They see it. They don't see it that way. And, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say too much because I guess I don't know if I should I don't want to tell the whole plot or anything.
It's up to you. No, so far we've only talked about essentially like the first 50 pages. I mean, it's not like all this is set up, so I don't think it's too big of a
So also I want people to know that, like, you're not going to be reading this like thing where it's just sort of like, oh my god, you hear all this like stuff and discuss with you. Like, in a lot of ways, it's just like a sort of a hard-boiled kind of like adventure story where the guy's like sort of wisecracking his way through and getting, struggling and fighting and trying to figure out cool game mechanic, ways to sort of get over and get by, and relationships and things like that. I mean, we ended up talking about this because I guess when we're talking about abstract stuff, it's just sort of which end it's going. But like, that's not the story.
Yeah. I that is why I want to say that the real world storyline is like, so that the thing that kind of drew me in, like, oh, this is already going to be different. So that's why I kind of emphasize that in the beginning, because I think that's going to be the thing that draws people into your world, because again, you're giving instead of it just being, I'm playing a VR game because I want to, or because I need to make a couple extra bucks, or I'm stuck in the game. It's where humanity is trying to save itself by playing this virtual reality game uh, as in a way to try to fight off a larger threat. Except that some people in power have started to promote the status quo instead of promoting humanity's best interest in pushing the boundaries against the nanites.
Yeah, but they, of course, that is the best interest. Like it's like, look, if you're if most of humanity is dead and you're hanging on by your all fingernails, like, do you want to take risks with people going out and playing and who might not be the best players? Like, no, you really are going to be very risk averse. You'd be like, okay, we need only the best players to get the resources to go and play, and that's a completely reasonable viewpoint. It's just really, I think, wrong in the long term. But like, you can see. But the thing is like, what I try to do is like try and make the antagonists. I think I could probably write a book where like the bad guys were the heroes. I could probably make the other thing where like Miles is like a bad guy who's trying to undermine a system that's barely hanging on to keep humanity alive. You could write that story and it would be a great story. And that's really what I tried to. But one of the things I really wanted to try and do is to try and not. I mean, I still made them bad guys, and it's told from Miles' perspective. But I at least wanted there to be a logic there where you weren't looking at those guys and being like, well, what are they, just a bunch of jerks? Like, is that really what it's all about? Like, they're just a bunch of jerks? Like, no, like they have their ideas. Yeah.
There's definitely I think the part that kind of crystallizes it for me, at least, again, this is all very beginning of the novel, like first 50 pages or whatever. So it's not spoilery. There's a conversation between your main character, Miles Bones, and I forget her name. She's the representative.
Maya.
She's the what was it?
Maya.
And Maya, who's Maya Eastman, who is the heir to the Eastman, clan, and they're both firm believers. It's like that youthful enthusiasm and idealism. Like, oh, I'm right, and I'm right. And it's there's a lot of rhetoric between the two, and you can tell, like, but they both really do believe what they're saying. And I think that's where you get the Eastman idea of like, oh no, the system is set. It might be rigged, but it's for humanity's benefit. There's the justification, like we're working hard so that only the best go to the front lines, and we're trying to get them there as quickly as possible. And so if there's more competition, there's fewer resources for everybody. And so we're really trying to streamline that so that we get the best of the best of the best. And it just happens to benefit us immensely. That's almost a secondary.
Funny how it works out that way. Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, that's exactly.
It's a secondary benefit, but it's and that's part of the zealousness of youth. And I think you did that very well, because once you later on the story, you get to see other Eastman ideals and the more jaded versions of that concept. Is like, okay, you really get to see what's the real power players and what they're thinking and why they're doing things, but you at least get to see that youthful zealousness of it, and from both sides. And I think that is a very interesting story just in of itself. And then we get into the game world. Now we'll go into the game world because your story isn't just politics and nanites and rural stuff.
Yeah.
Although that's interesting.
Everything, but I guess we can only talk about the setup. So like, because we don't want to give spoilers away. Yeah. But then it's I really try to one of the things I really wanted to try and do is like have some of the battle sequences sort of get hopefully defined through like hopefully some clever game tricks. It's like, okay, we're going to use. I don't even want to say it. Yeah. So I hopefully had enough of those kinds of things where it was players would be like, oh yeah, if these kind of rules were out there, I totally would use that game mechanic in like this kind of way, like because heck, people are smart, they'll figure out stuff.
And I think we can talk a little about your game without getting too spoilery. We also want to tease at least why your game world is different than like a standard MMO. Because I think again, people knowing that they're getting into like a fun game world is also a draw for them as far as the story goes. I think a few tidbits of like why your game world is different is okay. Like you don't want to like spoil all the major plot points, but like what makes your game world different than some other regular MMO? Like how does your character interact with the game world? I should say that makes it fun and interesting.
Um, so so this game is sort of supposed to be in some ways like a distillation of all the games. So most of the nanite that went out there was all like entertainment nanite, and most people were using it to play all sorts of virtual reality games and other kinds of things. And so the game itself is supposed to be this sort of distillation of like the like archetypical basis of like games, which I say is Dungeons and Dragons 3.5. I think you take all the different gaming systems in the world and you boil them down to its basic, most wonderful essence, you get Dungeons and Dragons 3.5. Who knew? Then I have like the main character. He doesn't actually get to use a lot of the main game mechanics. He has to sort of do it. He's got to do it old school.
Yeah, no, I thought that was kind of cool. In that it is a game world, the VR system once you get in there. And so it's set up for most people the same way like a MMO is set up. Hotkeys or like special features like the AI helps you with your sword swings, so you don't really have to learn, weapon skills or magic or whatever. And so for most of the players, that's the instance. But in the case of Miles Boone, again, I don't think this is useful because it happens within the first, like very quickly in the novel. His experience is going to be different. Like part of that bet is that he can't have luck, which is why it's beginner's luck. It's that, and that his luck skill is basically set to 0 when he creates his character as part of that deal, that bet, and that has some very interesting consequences in that he doesn't get access to that user interface system or that AI assisted system. More like most of VR MMO games that you read about on LitRPG, it's nobody really has to learn sword skills, nobody really has to learn how to throw magic, or it's all very game oriented in that in other novels. Again, they're like, I want to throw a fireball. I think about the fireball skill, and a flame comes to my hand, and I toss it. And so it's very automated in that sense. And in your world, at least for this main character, that's not the case. And I think that is a draw for because part of what he has to go through is that every skill he wants to learn, every combat ability, every whatever, he has to learn it the hard way. And so I think one of the things I really enjoyed about the novel was that how you drew from our current historical perspective of like experiences, whether it's going to be swordplay or thieving or apothecary or herbalism, whatever the case is. I'm not going to get too spoily because there's some cool things. But even like in magic, like you draw from real social structures and real cultural experiences, and I thought that was cool.
Thanks, man. Yeah, well, I really hope people dig it. I guess we're all doing that. We're all writing the book that we wanted to read, right? As much as we can. So that's what I wanted to do. And I'm hoping that it's going to be sort of a long, slow build. I think everybody else in LitRPG have a real soft spot for the OP MC. Like those power fantasies are very satisfying. But just maybe by book 5 or 6 he can be like up there, like let's I'm gonna have my guy stuck
in this one, that's for sure.
He's gonna be stuck in the beginner's area for like the first 3 books, is my plan. I mean, he's gonna do a lot of interesting things, but that's the other thing is like conflict. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be Superman fighting an entire galactic whatever. One of the reasons why Batman is very compelling is because he doesn't have superpowers, and he kind of just does his thing. And you can have a really great conflict that's even smaller than that. It's like, okay, as long as it means something and it's clever, and you enjoy spending time with the people, like it'll be great. Hopefully, that's the idea.
Yeah, no, it's definitely cool. And like I said, for our genre, I think part of it for me to the draw of RPGs is always that power curve of like the characters start out low and powerless, basically, and through hard work and sometimes luck and just good planning, analytical skills, and intelligent play, you become more and more powerful.
Yeah.
And that for a lot of people is something they would love to see in real life. Like a lot of us always feel like we're at the noob zone most of our life in our in our situations. Like we feel very powerless occasionally.
Yeah.
And so it's always nice to imagine or hope that there's a system in the world or in some multiverse where just through hard work and intelligent play, you could become important and powerful and satisfied and happy fully. And I think that is part of the draw for the genre, because that those experiences are told time and time again, and by extension, because we see ourselves in the characters and the stories, we feel that sense of accomplishment.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's like at the heart of it. Because I mean, I also really do believe that, I mean, so the neat thing about LitRPG is it sort of makes that manifest. It's like, you have a number and you have a concrete thing, but I mean, if you go to the gym and do a certain number of reps over a certain amount of time, you will get a strength point. It won't be this kind of thing where it's just like, here it is, it's there. I can understand
would love to
it.
see the strength point though. I think that's the difference between it's like if I saw like, oh, a floating one for my strength, I'm like, oh, I actually have
I would be hitting the gym a heck of a lot harder. We are, yeah.
So I agree with you.
Or at all.
Okay.
Hitting the gym at all.
Okay, so we talked about the story. I think we've probably talked about enough about your story, and that we're not going to spoil anything, but we've highlighted, like, I think, at least to me, some of the cooler aspects of your novel that make it different, make it a compelling story for people. Like there's again the politics and the real world storyline stuff. And again, it's not. I'd say it's probably maybe 30% of the novel. Most of the story does take place in the game, but even that 30% is very compelling and it's very interesting. And again,
yeah, I didn't.
Those two worlds are tied in makes it super interesting.
Yeah, I wanted the real world to be as much of a story. Like I didn't want it to be this thing where you're spending time there and you're just waiting to get back into the game. I wanted to I mean, one of the things I think that like Alan Kong is quite good at, I actually talked about you with this for your books too, is that like, you basically have a portal fiction, so you sort of leave all that behind, and so it's like another world, and so that's good. Like if you're going to have it where someone's going back and forth, you want to make sure that like the story is continuing, the plot is continuing, like the characters are continuing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll come backwards. You were just trying to segue to somewhere else, and I completely threw us back in the what we were saying.
I was like, okay, so I don't want to spoil too much of the story because we want it to be special for people still. So we talked about your real world storyline. We talked about the game world, what makes it unique and interesting. The game world itself is based on 3.5 D&D rule set, which I'm just a big fan of. But there's also a sense of realism in that your main character, as an isolated incident, has to learn all these skills the hard, long way, and that's part of the experimental journey. But of course, he's also facing foes in game and out that are trying to stop him from basically proving his thesis that somebody who doesn't play by the party's rules can still be as beneficial or even do better. So that's all in the game. There's adventures, there's magic, there's plenty of dungeon stuff and killing of monsters. That's all very cool. So we'll leave that at there. Let's go back to your writing stuff a little bit. Is this the first book that you've ever written? Or I know you mentioned you've done screenplays before, but is this the first novel?
This is the first novel, and it's very different. It's you can use adverbs. How awesome is that? Because you're writing a screenplay, you can't say like he ran angrily. What does that mean? It's like you just have to say like it's not. If you don't understand why the person is running and what the emotional tone of it, like then you've probably done something wrong. Whereas like there's just so many fun things that you can do with a novel. I'm just sort of like, holy. There's a reason why novels, but people aren't sitting around reading screenplays. People are sitting around reading novels.
I know that a little bit for me because I've read plays before. Why expand a little bit on what you just mentioned? Like what makes the novelization of a story different than the screenplay version of a story?
So in a screenplay, all you can do is it's like a skeleton that you're trying to add to a whole bunch of other really creative people who are going to do all the other things with it. All you can have is like what you're going to see and hear. That's it. What you're going to see and hear. There's no like what you thought about it. the things that people do, you have to make it understandable. Like if you say someone's running angrily, right? That has to be because everybody who's watching the movie already knows why that guy would be angry. He's chasing after the guy who just just punched his mother in the face. Okay, so he's running. It's like, well, you show the person punching his mother in the face, and then he's running. You're only really seeing him running. You only know the emotional content of that because of the context that you set up in what you see. When you in a story, you can start off with the guy running angrily after somebody and fill it in backwards. So if you're writing a screenplay well, you sort of try and avoid adverbs and other kinds of things because I think in some ways that's a lot of times when you see in a movie and it's like, that doesn't make sense. Why, I don't understand what he's doing. Like first he was doing this and now we're here later and like his motivation doesn't make sense. It's not consistent. And a lot of times you get to those problems like that because in the screenplay it makes total sense because they in the screen direction it's saying stuff like, well, he felt this way and this way and that, but it's not supported by any of the stuff you've seen before earlier in the movie. So you have to do that. Whereas like, with novels, the thing that I'm sort of finding out is that like, you could have somebody sitting in a room and go on a grand emotional journey as they just sort of think about things, like, that would be actually pretty boring, but because there'd be no plot and, once you do that exactly, but you could at least do it and have it be coherent. You could be like, oh, I can follow along with this guy. It would not be the story that I particularly enjoy, but at least it would make sense. Whereas in a movie, it just wouldn't make sense at all.
Well, I think like what the grand journey, like as you're sitting in a room, like isn't that like what's that? By Patrick Rothfuss, Tell the Wind or King the Wind or whatever.
Oh
like,
yeah, well, so
what that is. I'm like, oh,
so Patrick Rothfuss is a great example because so he uses his ability with language, which is pretty darn profound, to sell things that actually, like in a movie, like I guess he sold to Lionsgate his thing, and I'm just so many of the things that people like about those books will not translate to the screen at all well. Because it's sort of just like, it's like, okay, I have this sword and I'm doing these things with the sword and he's having all this sort of emotional and intellectual thoughts about it. That will not at all. I mean, in fact, in some ways, one of the things he does is he sometimes hides the fact that like the physical concrete stuff that he's doing doesn't, it's like oh, his eyes are changing because his emotions are changing. It's like, okay, well that's great and everything like that, but I mean, are they really going to like use CGI to like have the character's eye color change? And will people actually understand like what the different emotional tones that means will be? Like, it's like that's not actually going to like, that's not how we interpret movies, So I'm really curious as to, I worry that that's going to just suck because a lot of what's great about that is not translatable.
Yeah. A lot of it is just, thoughts, emotions, concepts, like imaginings in one's mind. And I kind of had the same issue with Stephen King's translation of like the Dark Tower into the movie. Like you read the book and like, oh, this is amazing. I can't see how they're going to do this, and they didn't really do it well. Mostly because this is totally off topic, but mostly because they didn't translate the same brutalness that's possible because they wanted to go for a PG-13 rating on that movie, and that was just that already set limiters on what you could do to get that rating, and so even in that smaller box, it was still hard. They made it harder by putting it in the box, I should say, because that particular novel, that series, is very introspective of like what the main character is thinking and feeling and doing, and the brutality of the universe and the world, and the things that happen to that poor child in those novels is not exactly kid friendly.
Yeah, so that's the worst of both possible worlds. So like, not only can they not bring in like the adverby internal stuff, but then they even nerf the sort of plot stuff because they need to not have it be a little too brutal. I mean, frankly, I'm glad I don't know that I want to go see a movie where he's getting tortured too bad. It's a little maybe a little too much for me.
I hear, but again, it is part of the narrative structure of that story, and that it's in a lot of Stephen King stuff it's people's personal hells, and for the singer that is part of it. He gives up everything for its vengeance, essentially, making whatever sacrifices are necessary, and that's very much part of that first novel, and that's very blatant. Like you hope that, I mean, when you go into the novel, you hope because he's the hero, he's going to do the right thing, and at the end, you're like, oh no, he's not the hero necessarily, and he realizes that, and that definitely wasn't how that
Were they
buddy.
able to make that arc, or did the movie just sort of? Because I didn't actually see it yet.
The movie basically ends, spoiler folks, where Roland the Gunslinger and the kid walk off into the sunset, eating ice cream or whatever, holding hands basically. To go on
so they completely, they destroy the entire moral of the movie, of the book. Oh my God.
Oh, yeah,
we're the worst. We're the worst. We ruin every story in Hollywood. I don't even know why I'm saying we. I haven't been in the business in like 7 years, but whatever.
Yeah. But like thinking about it as a superhero film, like you're probably going to be fine. But if you've read the books at all, like that translation is not work very well. So I kind of see what you're saying in that you have a lot more freedom in the novel, is it in writing a novel, to tell the story that you want to tell, because you're not just the screenwriter, you're not just telling the skeletal outline of the story, you're also the director, you're also the actor,
Production designer,
all those other levels of flavor to your story. Because in my mind, I'm always thinking of the end product when I'm thinking, oh, movie to novel. Okay, that makes sense. That sounds easy. Or like those skill sets, translate well. I'm like, but from what you're telling me, like, oh no, it's a very different skill set. Like
there is a very concrete reason that most of the adaptations you see aren't very good, and that when they are good, it's really like a wonder and a tremendous thing. Like when somebody takes the book and really do a job, you're like, that is an amazing accomplishment. I'm very impressed with people who can do that.
So there you go. So thank you very much for that information. Let's see. What kind of writer are you? Are you a pantser or are you an outliner?
I'm an outliner. I'll plug somebody who I think is probably out of print. But anyway, I just, when I first started saying I was going to do this, I basically went to a lot of this how to write a book kind of books just to kind of look around, and hoped I could get the gist of it within like the Kindle free 10%. Not to like rip them off, but just to see which one I would actually want to buy, like which one seems to like have. And I settled on. Have you ever heard of like the Marshall Plan? All right. So anybody who's looking at this writing, I found it really helpful. It helps you sort of sequence things. I think it's pretty common in terms of writing advice, like the scene sequel, kind of. That's how you sort of put it all together. Where it's like you have a scene where the character tries to do anything and then usually doesn't work out, and the sequel is just like, oh, he has like an emotional response, an intellectual response, a physical response, and then he says, oh, and then he comes to you, and I'm going to try this, and that's. You just sort of link those all together, and eventually you're at the end of your story.
Honestly, this is for me. Like writing is something new for me. None of that. Like those words have meanings to somebody, I think. But like to me, I'm like, oh, those. Ooh, that's not fancy. Because my background is like in mathematics and physics and that kind of stuff. As far as like educational experience, it's like, so writing for me entirely is like this new thing. Like I've never been creative my entire life, and I mean outside of this podcast basically, and so writing is, even structurally, is like this new venture. Like most of my writing is very for the first book 22 was very stream of consciousness, like, oh, these are my daily adventures of my characters, and I kind of had like a rough outline in my brain, like, oh, these are things I want to happen by the end of the story basically, and I kind of had like a vague notion of it, and so you can kind of tell reading those stories. I'm writing one currently where it's like, oh, I try to outline everything a little more detail. I'm finding it's a little easier to do that. And we lost him for a second. Looks like he's hopefully going to join back. Maybe. But yeah, that's basically my experience. So those things that he mentioned were very, very new words to me. So the Marshall Plan. There you go, folks. And we'll wait for him to come back. And in the meantime, we can see what happens. Like I said, we'll cut this out, folks, if not a big deal. Let's see.
And that's how you write the perfect novel.
Oh, thank you very much. That's such great insight. I don't think I would have ever thought of that. I don't
think I could ever say it again. It just came to me and it was so clear, but I just don't think I could even put it into words ever again.
Yeah. One time, and that's it. For ladies, you've witnessed a miracle, folks. Thank you very much for being a part of this unique human experience.
I could have done it without you. I mean, you were dropping insight like. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Like those story ideas were very interesting. I have to say, like, I'm definitely an outliner. now because I see the benefit of it. But at the same time, like the in between stuff is very pantsy for me, and that it's very like I'm not sure exactly all the dialogue I'm using, all the actions I'm going to go through, especially the game mechanics, but like how he's implementing game mechanics in the story that I'm writing now. So it's an interesting experience
Well,
as far as like I go. Yeah.
One of the interesting things is that like the game mechanics can actually work like the structuring of a novel. Like in other words, that whole scene sequel thing I was talking about, it just means like, I'm trying to do something and here's what's happened about it, and now I'm going to go do something else. Like with game mechanics, it basically fulfills that function. It's like I kill the orc and I get the gold, and now I'm going to go and figure out the trap. And it's like that it basically does that for you. So in some ways, like I'm actually sort of surprised that you've done no scene sequel, because like when I read your stuff, it's like something happens, you have the reaction to it, and it's there. So I mean, a lot of this stuff is just sort of making just telling you things that you sort of hopefully already kind of get just from reading anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it is. So you read 400 or 500 stories, LitRPG novels, you're like, you kind of get a vague idea of like, okay, this works, this doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what informs my storytelling. As far as like structure goes for books 1 and 2, Adventures in Terror, is very much like, I'm pulling things from a lifetime of reading experiences and watching television and like seeing 3-act structures in the movies, and that's kind of what I base those storytelling opportunities. Like I know I need a beginning, the middle, end. I know how to action, cooldown sequence, action, or whatever. So that's
you know how to like okay, and like I know what what a finale sort of feels like because you've lived through them, so many of them. Yeah.
That's part of our culture. I think it's just culturally like we're exposed to so much of like those storytelling opportunities, like whether it's television series or movies or books. Like you kind of almost through osmosis absorb a little bit of that.
Well, we are all experts at that. I mean, that's the other thing. It's like, I mean, one of the things that's cool about like writing is that like anybody, in some ways, anybody can. I mean, to get good at it takes some time. And, you need to be able to write the actual words and all of that. But like as far as just the sensibility, we all have it because we all have just watched and read and enjoyed all of this stuff for decades. So like we're all experts on it, and like there's no one who isn't.
Yeah, I know there are always those writing books that like, oh no, storytelling is a natural part of the human experience. Like everybody can be a storyteller because we all have that need to convey information. Like evolutionarily, we're information conveyors, and that's part of what gives us an evolutionary advantage. Why we develop speech and cognitive abilities and the ability to conceptualize is all information from one generation to another. So the ability to do that in a narrative structure isn't that huge of a leap that people think it is sometimes. And I find that to be true to a degree in that everyone can tell an anecdotal story at least. And so just translating that to the pages is there's a skill set there to do well, but everybody has that ability to at least tell a story.
Yeah, I mean, some of the funniest, best storytellers I know, they don't write, but they tell you about that time when you were in high school and this and that happened and you're pissing your pants. And it's like, and like the guy is a contractor, like my buddy's a contractor. He's an unbelievable storyteller. He's just like, he lays me out. Like,
do you include like any of your real life experiences in your story?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Scarily enough, given my plot. Yeah, but we'll just set that aside.
I do the same thing. I mean, because it goes back to like, writing what you know about. And for me, as somebody who doesn't have a lot of stories, like, I just draw from my life. Like, this experience that my character went through, that's something I do, or something I've done in the past, or that's some emotional response that I can kind of resonate with because I had something similar in my life. And so even like those funny anecdotal stories that we're talking about tonight, if you get those told in my novels, like those are names are changed, but
I probably have some. Well, anyway, yeah. Anyway, well, next question.
Okay, you don't have to share. It's okay. We understand some of those embarrassing stories about your novel. We aren't necessarily from you. Okay.
That time I was fighting a rabbit and I lost. Yeah.
Okay. We'll go back to a few more writing questions. What's the easiest and hardest thing about writing for you?
I think the easiest thing was dialogue really comes pretty easily to me. And then the hardest thing, I guess, is a twofer. One is just actually sitting down and writing, like just getting my butt in the chair and doing that. And then I guess like actual inside writing stuff, it takes me longer to sort of work through a combat sequence, and I think some of that is also just because, you picture the whole thing and then just figuring out how to sort of lay that out in a way where you want it to be long enough to sort of flesh it out, but if you make it too long, then it somehow becomes sort of dull. So you have to just strike that right balance of like, okay, you're painting a really good little picture of a movie of the combat in somebody's mind, and then but not belaboring it and keeping it fast as you can't describe something as fast as it happens in real life. Yeah. I mean, a sword fight is over a lot faster than writing what would actually happen in a sword fight.
3 or 4 paragraphs for that one short stroke is only like a millisecond for the actual comma. Like,
yeah, so there's a kind of a fun. Whereas writing dialogue, it comes about at about the same speed as saying something.
Right. So I get it. For me, it's almost dialogue is not hard for me. It's like the structure of writing is challenging for me. Like sitting down is always challenging for writing. Just dedicating time to doing your craft and not being distracted by Facebook or the internet is always a challenge. But for me, like learning how to outline correctly or how to outline my thoughts and organize everything so that the pacing is I think that was a challenge for me before. So I'm like, every writer.
Yeah, as we discussed earlier, I kind of paid my dues with all of that. So it used to be really, really hard. You bang your head against it enough times eventually. I mean, I think everybody in the genre is getting better, from what I can tell. They're all struggling with it. Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
Okay. Let's see. Writer's block. You ever get writer's block?
Say it one more time.
Do you get a writer's block, and if so, how do you deal with it?
I have never had that. I guess what I would say is, to the extent that I've had it, I didn't sit down in the chair, so I never actually got to just sort of sit there and be like, in some ways it was enough to just sort of keep me from even sitting down in the first place. So it hasn't been like fast from like, oh, well, I'm here and I'm ready to write and just nothing's happening. It's more like, I'm just not feeling it, so I have a harder time sitting there and doing it. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. I talked to some of the other guys in West who are all outliners. Like, we don't get writer's block in West because we outline everything. And so it's just a matter of filling out those spaces. And I guess that's part of the pro of being an outliner instead of a pantser, is that you have structure and so you have a place to go in between. The downside of it, of course, is that some people will feel greatly restricted by the outline. And I have to go here. I can't just go on this weird story narrative because the outline says I'm a creative, that kind of stuff. So there are pros and cons for each individual.
At some point or other, you should out everybody as pantsers versus liners. You should let the public know who's who.
I think I can try to ask these questions during the interviews.
Actually, it'd be really curious because I'm sort of curious if it would matter at all about who I like more, and I wonder if it turns out, weirdly enough, I really like pantsers, or I really like I don't know.
It kind of depends on. It's also kind of like different narrative structures. Like I can think of Earth Online, which is EYRTH or something. It's a skunk RPG, and the author just goes in these really weird trips in his narrative because he actually did a really cool thing in that. It's just a perspective of his writing style, his creative side, and that he actually has a soundtrack that goes along with the story. And so each chapter has a specific song that's supposed to go along with it, that you're supposed to play or eat it, I guess, and whatever you wish to enjoy.
Well, that's the whole thing. The last movie I saw that I actually really liked was Baby Driver, and that was apparently all built around a soundtrack too. The connection between the music. I have a writing playlist for my, that I listen to when I write. I don't know if you do. I love music when I write.
Okay, what do you listen
to? Just the stuff that I printed on. So it's like stuff like Rush, Who, Marillion, stuff that's got a little bit of like a and then a lot of contemporary rock. Although there's some random stuff in it. I don't want it to be like too atmospheric. I want it to have like Zeppelin. Stuff that's heard a lot of it like a million times, but it's not exactly the stuff that I would just put on if I had people over or if I was just sort of like hanging out and wanted to switch. I wanted to have a certain pace or level of energy, I guess, is the only way I can put it.
No, that makes sense, especially one kind of sound that encourages a certain type of thinking for a comment scene as opposed to just straight dialogue, which may be more toned down energetically wise. I get that. I can't write with music on. Like, it's too distracting for me. I try to write when it's really super quiet. Like, even I've more recently done it to me in the morning just because everybody's asleep. The whole neighborhood is down. Like, there's not as much traffic on Facebook, so I can get as distracted by that. But to do that same kind of atmospheric encouragement for my story, I'll watch movies of a certain type. Like, I wrote a whole kung fu scene in Adventures in Starbucks because I had watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and was it Drunken Master, and so all those kind of informed just tonally, but also like, oh, I like that scene. Oh, this is inspiring to me. So like, I'll take aspects of that and incorporate the story. And so like, very much writing is like, you can kind of tell what I was watching during like those particular times, like what I was just happening to be like.
Yeah, I mean the finished book is in some ways it's like, you know, it ends up actually in some ways the same way a song is, like, you know, song gets associated with a certain time in your life or a certain event in your life, and different parts of your book end up sort of working the same way. Yes, sorry.
No problem. Okay. Next question. You're definitely writing a series, right? This isn't just a one-off, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm trying to give it a decent amount of closure, but this is the first of what I mean, I actually have I don't have it fully outlined, but I have a gestural outline of like a pretty, I mean, you can see already in the first book, like that's going to take us through the first three. And then I have another book or two beyond that of like where I plan to have it go. And I think some of the stuff I'm trying to work about do, and I think this guy's adventure, I mean, I think I've made a pretty big world and they're dealing with some pretty big stuff.
Yeah, there are different places you can go in your story.
There's stuff that I think would be really cool and interesting to people that I don't know if I want to say. People haven't even read the first book yet, but there's like things that I want to do that I think are going to sort of move through a lot of the aspects of the genre itself. And you can already see that from the bat. You're gonna I can at least say this. Book 2 is going to be called Foundation Strength, and it's going to be basically, you know, base building in some ways. So like, and you know, and as you can see, it's like, you know, I call the series character development. Right. And like this, you know, beginner's luck, foundation strength. It'll be something intelligence, something dexterity, you know, and there's like what 6 main character abilities. So I think I'll at least use all of those, I would suspect.
Okay, so that's good. That makes more sense because one of the things that I kind of saw as a drawback in the first book is like there wasn't a lot of progression on that main quest arc. Like you got one of the 5. I think what finished. I'm like, I was like, oh no, that's it. And I was like, oh, okay, everything else is like antagonist, like, trying to keep him from completing his bet and everything. So I was like, oh, okay, so that makes sense that you're planning for a much larger arc than I thought was going to be. In my mind, most of these stories in my brain, for whatever reason, kind of go into like a 3 novel structure, like, oh, you know, trilogy. But I always forget, like in our genre, like 10, 11, 12 books aren't in common anymore. Like the Land is on book, I think 7 or 8. Marilia is going to be it's on book 10 now. Book 11 is coming out next month. Devil Jealousy is already 3. He's planning for like 5 or 6 at least. So I'm like, oh yeah, I forget that our novels go on so long.
Yeah, but I really am trying to, you know, I think I'm hoping that I really will, you know, arc it so that like first I want to have each book have a satisfying conclusion where, you know, it's just like, and check out next week when we sort of pick up and, you know, right. That sense of like closure. Like I do hope when somebody finishes the book, they go, okay, that was satisfying. I feel like I got an ending.
I'm thinking like that's what this reminds me of. Because when I was reading the end of your novel, I'm like, this was very familiar. This isn't like the same ending that I see in other books. Like there's kind of a closure, but it's also a to be continued in the same instance. And I'm like, it's like part 1 of a trilogy. And like the movie structure, I'm like, oh, that's where it just clicks in my brain. Like, oh, that's what it is. Basically, it's very much as like as an episodic or like as a movie trilogy. We know it's going to be continued.
Yeah. So I really don't. I mean, maybe I'll end up doing it and I'll have to eat these words, but I don't ever want to leave people on a cliffhanger.
Right.
Conversely, like, I'm trying to tell like hopefully a longer story that has specific little arcs, not little, but book length arcs within it.
Right. Okay. It just makes sense. It just clicked in my mind, like, oh, that's what it reminded me of. Like, oh, it's like part one of Kill Bill or whatever. Volume one. It's like, oh, there's definitely not a cliffhanger, and that's something is not resolved. But simply, it's like, oh, there's a jumping off point for book two immediately, like seconds after the ending of book one, potentially. And like, okay, this makes sense. Screenwriter, screenplay, movie, or like novel. I'm like, okay, those two are meshing that in.
Yeah, so I mean, well, I don't know. We'll see what everybody thinks about it once they read it.
No, I generally think that this is going to be well received. You're probably going to have some detractors who are like, I don't like politics in my novels at all. That might be a thing. There come a few other spots in your novel where, like, okay, some people aren't going to like particular aspects of it. Other people are just going to love it immensely. So, I mean, that's like any novel, like any story, anything you put out there creatively, you're going to have people who love certain aspects and people who don't like other aspects, and it'll be a mixed bag. But I think overall, this is really good in my opinion. I just from the very onset, like the first few pages of the story, you're like, this is different, this is new, and it's nice and it's a little bit refreshing, especially when for someone like me who's reading 10 novels a week in the genre and you're getting a lot of the same tropes or the same concepts. It's like, oh, this is different, so that's nice.
I think we should end this here because
that's perfect.
It's going to go downhill for me from here.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Usually at this point we talk a little bit about marketing and like, what are you doing? I don't know. Are you doing any marketing?
Not really. You're it. It all rests on your shoulders, Ramon.
Success or failure of this relies on me, I guess. Yeah, that's kind of what this podcast is for, is that we get to highlight the stories that maybe don't get a lot of press, or people who don't do advertising on Facebook or other methods. Like, there are a lot of other people who have.
I'll learn my way through that, but I don't know anything about it.
No. Yeah, I kind of feel the same way for my novel stuff, in that I don't do promotion. I talk about it occasionally on this podcast. I'll do an occasional Facebook ad, but even then, I'm like, I'm not sure how effective they are, or on Twitter ads, or all that other stuff. Like, it's very. It's different than writing a novel. It's different than anything I've ever read.
Totally, yeah.
That's a different skill set that I don't currently have, and I should probably learn. But at the same time, like,
as you figure it out, let me know, because it seems like seems useful, but I just
James Hunter is really good at marketing his stuff, and so does Kevin McClure, I think it is. They both do, like, I met them both at Dragon Con. And James Hunter is actually a regular on a bunch of different panels at Dragon Con, or at different panels at conventions around the United States, where he talks about marketing and he talks about urban fantasy, because that's what he also does, urban fantasy and also the LitRPG stuff. But he's a pro at like doing ads and like having like data structures and like seeing what works well for his stuff and having quantitative data for it. I'm like, that's a lot of technical stuff and skills that I'm like, I don't currently possess, but it's well. Yeah.
I'm going to, and this is the famous last words of idiots everywhere. I'm going to just hope that my work speaks for itself.
You definitely have a place where, and I think this is just the advent of social media, where your fans can communicate with you, like a place where you can say, oh, this is where you can get the best announcements, whether it's going to be a Facebook page or your own web page or a Twitter page or whatever. Where you can kind of say, "Oh,
I'll get a blog up." I mean, I'll get a blog and a Facebook page going.
It's easy to do. It's just like
so. Hey, look forward to that, America.
Because
you're going to have a very amateurishly done blog and Facebook thing to check out.
It's more for them than it is for the writer. Like, for the writer side, it's like, oh, you get to have a space where you can say whatever you want to and get little sneak peeks at your writing and stuff and talk to your audience a little bit. But for them, it's also that one place where they can go and say, oh, this is an author I like, I want to support him, or I want to talk about his stuff. When he makes announcements, I can share it as a part of supporting his work. And so I think for the fans, it works really well, because then you can also see quantitatively, go, oh, these are core supporters that really like my stuff. You get a quantitative number saying, oh, 500-600 people, whatever it is. and you know that these are the people who are going to be like your champions, or the people who are going to like share your posts and help do like any kind of ground, what's it called, guerrilla marketing, like
Yeah.
talking about your stuff. And so just having that there, I think, is very useful for a lot of people. Like maybe not, I'm not as popular as like other people like Alan Kong or even Blaze Corbin or Matt Fatchfield. Even they have really good Facebook.
And some of that, I think, I mean, I hope anyway, is just also because they just put out more books, like, I suspect by the time you're on book 4, you'll, I would think that you'll keep climbing the ladder or whatever it is you want to do.
So, okay, so and the here, we got places to be. Things I told you it's going to be a couple hours at least. So that's what it is. But everybody, thanks for hanging out, watching. Go get beginner's luck. By the time most of you see this, it should be out now. So go enjoy it, and thank you, Aaron, for
Thank you so much. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
You have a good day. Okay.
Take care. Bye bye.
For Geek Bites Podcast, I'm Ramon B. Guys, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye.